So let's find out how Ben managed this ethical challenge. He did so by deciding to use his junior status to his advantage. His usual style was open and outspoken, but only after thinking through an issue thoroughly. So he decided to play to his natural strengths. He approached the executive director first and the accountant from an open, inquisitive perspective. He assumed the role of the seemingly naive questioner rather than the accuser. This was a comfortable role for him to assume since he was new in the organization. The executive director, who did know of the problem, was really overwhelmed by more than this issue. She didn't take action, but shortly after his conversation with her, she left the organization. Ben concluded that her decision was already in the works to leave when he approached her, and his questions were just not a priority for her at that point. On the other hand, the more senior level accountant at the nonprofit was willing to accompany Ben to the auditor, and together they developed a resolution. They developed an average cost per box, and they informed the corporate donors that they would assign that value to their donations unless the donors submitted a written audit of the perhaps greater value for the IRS. They were transparent with the Internal Revenue System about their approach. Donors, although perhaps not thrilled with the new method, didn't see it as a personal accusation. So when Ben reflected on his ability to speak up in this situation, he identified several factors that enabled him. Remember the enablers? So first of all, he said, fear enabled me. He wanted to protect himself and the organization from the IRS. And then he said, ego enabled me. He was an ambitious, confident man. He had already had the experience of being positively rewarded for speaking up, questioning an accounting error in his job interview. And thirdly, he said, my desire to learn and understand enabled me. He liked to ask questions and to think through problems for himself. So now that we've heard what Ben did, let's think about which levers were available to Ben and which ones he used. So he's pretty new in the organization, so it wasn't really learning from experience that much. But he did see for positive reinforcement. In other words, he remembered the time in his job interview when he had raised a question and was positively rewarded for that. He also looked for mentors or a support system. Remember, he talked to a number of people. First, he went to the executive director. When that didn't work, he didn't stop, and he went to the senior level accountant within the organization. Together with that accountant and with the external auditor, they were able to solve the problem collectively. As far as distinguishing preferences from orders, remember that the executive director had directly said, I'm not interested in a lot of data, I'm really just interested in relationship building. But Ben decided to not take that as an order, but rather to define his job more broadly and to think about the longer-term relationships and health of the organization and to use that as a frame for his arguments. And then there's the issue of paying attention to form and substance. Ben decided to approach this issue by asking questions, by positioning himself as a learner rather than as someone who is accusing anyone of intentionally being unethical. And that worked both within the organization, but it also worked with their solution when they communicated to the external corporate donors. He did play to his strengths. We know that Ben was somebody who was intellectually curious and liked to problem solve. And then there's the issue of aligning with purpose. Ben was he respected this organization. He admired the organization. And so he wanted to do things that were going to be in alignment with the long-term health and well-being of the organization. Finally, in terms of practice, you could say that he had a little practice by going to the executive director before he went to the accountant. Even though he got a negative response the first time, he probably became more fluent with the way he was presenting his issues. So it's interesting to think about the levers that were available to Ben and how he used them. There may have been other levers that you could identify, but this is an example of how someone who is at a very junior level within the organization can still find effective ways to voice and act on their values.